Okay, I'm going to get started here. If anyone comes in late, that's fine. We'll allow them to come in. So good morning, everybody, and thank you for signing up for today's Amphibians of New York State program. This program is being presented by the Rogers Center and Mr. Eric Diefenbacher, professor at SUNY Morrisville. And you can see Eric's on the screen too, the one not talking. My name is Simon Solomon. I'm the director of the Rogers Center, and I've had the pleasure to work alongside Eric for a number of years now. Eric's a board member of the Rogers Center, so we're thankful for that. Before I hand it over to Eric, I'd just like to remind everybody that the Rogers Center property remains open and accessible to the public 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And the Visitor Center is now back open with some new exhibits inside as well. Visitor Center at the Rogers Center is open Thursday through Saturday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. And of course, if you'd like to visit us and learn a little bit more, please visit www.friendsofrogers.org. So without further ado, I do not have anyone else in the waiting room at the moment. And if I do, I'll let them in. I'd like to introduce Mr. Eric Diefenbacher. Eric, you want to take it away?
Sure. Thanks, Simon. I hope everybody can hear me right now. Thank you for joining us for this program. Again, this is Amphibians of New York that we'll be presenting here today. So I'll be going through all the salamanders, frogs, and toads of New York State. I did a Reptiles of New York State program last month. And if you're so interested in more programs that the Rogers Center will be putting on, I know I'll also be putting on a Preparing for Monarch Butterflies program next month. It is kind of late winter. We're in the mid-February here, doldrums of winter, and right now is actually a really good time to get prepared for seeing all of our spring, summer, and fall critters that are going to be coming out pretty soon, especially amphibians. It's good to get prepared right now for them. So we are going to be going through Amphibians of New York. As Simon mentioned, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat bar that you see at the bottom of your screen as you scroll down there, and we will be sure to get all questions at the end of the presentation today. Again, it's going to be about 30 or 40 minutes or so, and I'm just going through the salamanders and frogs and toads of New York State. If you bear with me here, I'm going to be sharing my screen with everybody. Hopefully this works for most everybody. I'm going to make a slight adjustment here. Okay. Great, and at this point, your screen should be filled with the presentation for today as I go through them. And again, this is the Amphibians of New York State. Thank you for joining me today. So we're going to go ahead and get right into this. Overall, we take a look at salamanders here. Salamanders, to start off with, are what are commonly known as in Greco-Roman terms as order Caudata, or the tailed amphibians. We have 18 species of salamanders within New York State, ranging from the very large at about 2 feet long, all the way down to really only a couple inches long that we can find really in our surrounding forests, and of course our seeps and streams throughout New York State. Salamanders, being amphibians, absolutely love damp habitats. Now, damp habitats, keep in mind, this can range anywhere from underneath moss and typically humid, the humidity underneath rocks near streams, seeps, and the term seep is really for those intermittent streams or those trickles of water that come out of the hillside that we often find in forests throughout New York State. Keep in mind that this can also mean basements. Some of you on this call probably are wondering why you're finding salamanders in your basements. Oftentimes, especially if you have an old stone-laid foundation, like we find in a couple of the older houses throughout Chenango County, these also make really, really nice habitats for salamanders, especially during the winter time, just looking to get away from the cold. All salamanders, being amphibians, have smooth, moist skin. There's no scales on salamanders, nor frogs, nor toads within New York State. That smooth, moist skin also makes them an excellent sponge, meaning that they are going to soak up things like oxygen and water and lots of other nutrients and all the good stuff in the environment, all the good stuff in the habitat, which makes them healthy. But this also makes them really good candidates to really soak up all of the bad stuff, all the toxins within the environments as well, which makes them really good, what are known as bioindicators, meaning that if the population of salamanders is dwindling within an environment, chances are there's something going on with that environment that we may need to take a look at. all of these salamanders also have teeth. They're not like our teeth. Our teeth being mammals, we have things like incisors and molars and canines. For salamanders, they just are peg-like teeth. They kind of look like a road cone, really. They, of course, have 4 very nicely developed limbs, a long tail, and, of course, a nice head and body region. Some salamanders also have what's known as a nasolabial groove, which are, if you see at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, there are these kind of projections that seem to come out of their nose, or at least lower than the nose. And what those are cirri, technically known as, or cirri. What those are chemical sensing structures. They basically help the salamander sense their environment and chemical cues of the environment. Not all salamanders have these, however. So let's get into the variety of salamanders that we have in New York State. We're going to start off big. We're going to start off with the eastern hellbender, Brancus Alleghaniensis. This is one of 4 species globally of giant salamander. There's the Chinese giant salamander, the Japanese giant salamander, and there's also, of course, the eastern hellbender and the Ozark hellbender. These guys get to be over 1 foot long, about 2 feet in length. They have, as you can see here, kind of a nice silky brown coloration to them. It can range from a solid tan to even some mottling, all right, that we have on both their dorsum and their belly. They have a nice fold of skin going down the side of their body that helps them absorb oxygen and water throughout their environment. These guys love cool, clear, clean streams, which over the past 100 years within New York State has been kind of hard to come by. These guys are in pretty rough shape in New York. Not only are we on the northern fringe of their range overall, at least throughout the United States, within New York State, there's 2 watersheds, the Allegheny Watershed, which is out near Buffalo, and then the Susquehanna Watershed, which is where most of us will reside. With the Susquehanna Watershed, there's been plenty of agriculture and also industry that's been polluting the waters for decades. Now, most of this has been cleaned up over the years. The Allegheny Watershed's doing a little bit better because it hasn't seen as much development. They have very small, indistinct eyes, and they primarily love to eat crayfish. This is another view of a hellbender on a nice flat rock here. You can see that overall girth of the salamander here. As far as breeding occurs, the male ultimately makes the nest, it builds the nest underneath very large flat rocks. And we're talking rocks that are at least a good 6 inches to a foot thick, 5 inches wide, or 5 inches, excuse me, 5 feet wide, 5 feet in width, very large rocks. They're very difficult to be able to lift and view under. With this, after the male builds the nest, the females will inspect the nest, lay eggs. The male will watch over the eggs until they hatch, and they hatch out roughly in about 60 days. But it takes them 2 years to be able to become full adults. And again, their range is in the Allegheny and the Susquehanna watersheds, and is an animal of research within New York State. It's a species of concern for us in New York State. Moving on with other permanently aquatic salamanders, we have the common mud puppy, Necturus maculosus. Very similar to a hellbender, however, it doesn't get nearly as big. Tops out at around about 10 inches to 12 inches, has external gills, these finger-like projections that you see here that kind of look a little fuzzy and a little reddish maroonish. Those are actually its gills. So it acts just like a fish. It breathes through and exchanges oxygen and dumps off carbon dioxide just like a fish with those external gills. And oftentimes, if you view them underneath the water, you see them constantly fanning those gills in order to move oxygen through their gills. They have a nice broad paddle-like tail. They can have anywhere between a very light brown to kind of a deep brown mottled coloration. 4 very small limbs. They can eat anything from crayfish, small crayfish, even to small minnows. I've even seen some reports of them taking smaller salamanders as well, but those reports have been few and far between. Habitat, again, is very nice, cool, clean streams, well-oxygenated streams and impoundments near former dams and even some current dams that we have around there. active night hunters as well. Active night hunters typically using chemosensory apparatus, chemical sensing cells right around their lips, and also a nice, very good sense of smell as well. In this case, with mud puppies, females will remain with the eggs and do a little bit of nest guarding for a little bit of 50 days or so before the larvae hatch out, and then the larvae are on their own after that, primarily consuming benthic macroinvertebrates or stream bugs within the stream. You can see the range down there, everything from Lake Ontario and Lake Erie through to the St. Lawrence River, Lake Champlain, Mohawk, and Allegheny waterways as well. Moving on to land, we have the Jefferson salamander. This is part of the Embystomatidae lineage. The cup-mouthed salamanders, also known as the mole salamanders. Now, they get this name because they love to use old rodent burrows, like mole burrows, especially near things like ponds and small swamps and so on, vernal pools especially. Now, for the most part, the adults of the embystamids will be underneath the ground, primarily eating invertebrates that they can get a hold of. Typically, one time of year, they will migrate to their egg-laying pools, usually in mass quantities. Now, with global climate change, a lot of our Embystomatidae salamanders have opted to start to migrate intermittently throughout their season. What that means is that it used to be a 1 week blitz where you'd have a lot of salamanders all going to their egg-laying pools, their vernal pools. With the onset of global climate change, we start to see where you start to get a slow trickle of individuals going to the vernal pools rather than a huge amount of them all at one time. So this migration is starting to change a little bit. The migration actually starts very, very soon as about March, April, depending on the conditions for some species, really like the spotted salamander, which we'll go over here in a minute. Typically is one of the first to emerge and go to these vernal pools. The formula for this early on is pretty simple. You need a rainy night, the ground needs to be thawed out, and needs to be about between 40 and 45 degrees. If you get those three conditions, typically you'll start to get salamanders moving, and frogs, of course, which we'll talk about soon. As far as the Jefferson salamander goes, you see the very lovely picture there of a Jefferson salamander. Kind of a nice slate blue to grayish back coloration, flecked with blue spots. Very long toes and digits for this species. It seems a little disproportional compared to other species of salamander that we'll talk about. Nice, long, and slender, between 4 to 8 inches. Typically, females will be bigger than males. Love vernal pools as well as any deciduous forests, those being broad-leaved type of trees, and of course conifers, evergreens, forests, and also mixed forests as well. They start to migrate to ponds around about March or April, where they reside within the state. They can lay about 10 to 20 eggs within a clutch. They will all, of course, be gelatinous masses that you can find within the water. We'll have a couple of pictures coming up on the spotted salamander that you can see a very similar gelatinous mass that they lay. The larvae will hatch out in about a month or so, month and a half, depending on the water conditions. Typically, the warmer and cleaner the water, the faster they will develop. And then, of course, they'll transform somewhere around about July or September, moving out onto land and then finding a burrow to hunker down for the winter. You can find them statewide except for the southeast counties of New York State, meaning things like Long Island and Manhattan. There's really just too much concrete down there for them. Moving on, we have the marbled salamander, Vistimo Opakum, rather small, stout type of salamander that we see here. There is a little bit of difference in coloration between the males and the females. The males that you see here in this picture will be a nice bright white, whereas the females are going to have more of a grayish or deeper slate gray type of coloration to them. Vernal pools and deciduous forests is where they absolutely love to live. These guys are a little different in that they will actually move to their vernal pools, to their breeding ponds, between September and December. They will lay their eggs, and what ends up happening is the female ultimately will lay a clutch of eggs and remain with the eggs until the fall rains come, When the fall rains come, that will fill up the ponds, the female will move on, the eggs will then hatch. The larvae then overwinter through times like right now, all right, between December, January, February, and just a little bit of March. And during that time, the larvae of marbled salamanders will actually grow and consume whatever invertebrates they may be able to get their hands on. What they're waiting for are the eggs and the larvae of the early spring laying salamanders, like spotted salamanders. So those larvae are already larger than the larvae that are going to be coming in the spring, and then they can consume them. So it's a bit different strategy here for marbled salamanders. As far as their range goes, you can find them pretty much in the southeastern counties of New York State, except for Manhattan. And of course, we have the classic spotted salamander, Vistimo maculatum. Very large, robust salamander. For many of us, we find these in many of the forest vernal pools when we're out hiking. And you may have even found these in your yard, especially underneath any logs or detritus, leaf litter, or even stones that you may have around your property. If you lifted those up, you may have found these guys. Black coloration on the back, kind of a lighter slate gray on the belly, and then the spots can range from 1 or 2 upwards to dozens along their back, running from their head all the way down their tail, which is of course what you can see here in this picture down at the bottom of your screen. Each of these yellow spots can range from kind of a school bus yellow to a nice bright yellow to an orange, and I've even seen some kind of on a red-ish coloration as well. Each individual is a little different. Each one of those yellow spots is a poison gland. Those poison glands are there to make them distasteful to other creatures. As far as their habitat goes, again, temperate or broad-leaved hillsides is primarily where they reside. Old rodent burrows, deciduous and carnivorous forests, swamps, beaver ponds, vernal pools, farm ponds, ponds that you may have in your backyard. Really, these guys are not picky at all. They will emerge again February, March, once those 3 conditions are met between the thawed ground, a nice rainy night, and between 40 and 45 degrees. These guys will begin to move to their vernal pools. They lay an egg mass, which is what you see there in the top right-hand part of your screen. That's a freshly laid egg mass. These guys will acquire a specific green algae that will infiltrate the eggs and actually provide oxygen and food for the developing larvae inside of them. The bottom picture there that you see, that greenish egg mass that you see, is actually an egg mass from a spotted salamander that's been infiltrated by this symbiotic algae. It's not a dead egg mass at all. It actually requires that algae to be able to oxygenate the embryos and act as a little bit of a natural sunscreen as well, so that way the embryos don't become fried by sitting in the sun. It's rather unique to the animal kingdom. And of course, you can find these statewide. I'll also take this time to point out the difference in egg masses between salamanders and frogs. I get this question a lot in my email inbox. The difference between salamander egg masses and frog egg masses, real quick way. If you end up holding them in your hand, salamander egg masses stay together. So if you hold it in your hand and you kind of wiggle it, it's kind of like holding Jello in your hand. It stays together. Frog egg masses act like spaghetti. They'll actually fall or drip through your fingers. So it's a little bit different there between salamanders and frogs, if you really need to tell a difference really quickly. Also, frogs tend to lay their eggs in strings or film in New York State, or individually. So chances are, if you see an egg mass that looks like that, it's salamander of some sort. Blue spotted salamander, or rather pretty salamander, black back coloration with nice blue spots adorning its side, back, and belly. All right, about mid-size for this one. You can see about 4 inches or so. Nice broad head, vernal pools, deciduous coniferous forest. You kind of see the trend here. Starts breeding around about March or April, depending on the elevation. Typically, lower elevations will see a sooner event than higher elevations because the higher elevations are not warm enough yet. About 300 eggs per loose egg mass, and then they'll start to metamorphose into grayish, green, brown, or silver individuals with some yellow flecking about in July or August or so, again, depending on the water conditions. All counties, again, except for Manhattan and Long Island. Tiger salamander, Ambista tigranum, a rather large ambistomid salamander. Large ambistomid salamander, we're talking around about 8 to 10 inches from snout to tip of the tail. Nice broad tail, robust body. It is not afraid to take down very large worms, large invertebrates, you name it. It has a great appetite. Nice yellow chin, strongly keeled tail, all right, nice and pointy on the top, and typically a nice black to brownish and also yellow to almost lime greenish striping from the head all the way down the tail. Loves bottomlands, old fields when it's adult, and mixed woodlands, of course, with nearby vernal pools. All right, they tend to lay eggs in early spring, about 20 to 100 eggs attached to plants and sticks underneath the water. They hatch in about 3 to 6 weeks. Larvae can metamorphose in the late summer, or in some instances, we're finding them actually metamorphosing later on, or even overwintering and taking more than a year to be able to metamorphose, depending on the water conditions and what kind of food is available. With these guys, you can find them only in New York State on Long Island, interestingly enough. Moving away from our mole salamanders, our Ambistomatidae salamanders, our cup-mouth salamanders that we've been talking about, we get into some of the smaller varieties of salamanders that we see. What are known as our Desmondate salamanders or our Dusky salamanders. These guys are part of the Plethodontidae family. It's a big long term for meaning lungless salamanders, meaning that, as the name implies, yes, these salamanders actually lack lungs. So how do they breathe? They actually use their skin, interestingly enough. That smooth, moist skin, as long as it stays wet, they can take in oxygen and, of course, respire carbon dioxide out of their skin as long as it remains moist, because gases need a wet medium in order to dissolve in. It's a lot like putting an air stone in a fish tank at home. That air stone is providing dissolved oxygen in the aquarium for the fish. This acts very similar to that. The Allegheny Dusky salamander, Desmondate Sacrophius, you can find these statewide except for Manhattan and Long Island. These guys love very intermittent or very wet, moist areas. We typically see these, you can find them around ponds, but they love fishless streams. Fishless streams underneath the leaf litter, underneath bark, stones, rock crevices, especially groundwater coming out of the hillside. They love that stuff, all right? In this case, there is another closely related Dusky salamander, which we'll talk about on the next slide. The big difference here, not only is the back coloration you'll see on the Allegheny Dusky salamander, Desmondate Sacrophius here down on the bottom right hand of your screen, you'll notice that there is a nice stripe running from the head all the way down the back of the tail, with some nice spots that run down the center of it. Our next Dusky salamander lacks these. Now, if this isn't a giveaway for it, if you look at the tail on this one, Allegheny Dusky salamander, actually does not have a keel. It is actually slightly rounded on the top. The next one does. It does have a keel. This one is rounded. Next one, of course, being the northern Dusky salamander, Desmondate fuscus, still loves springs, loves seeps, groundwater, etc. It does not like to be anywhere where there are fish because it can become a snack really quickly. They are very fast within their domiciles. They have a nice keeled or pointy back to their tail. They do not have a stripe running down their back. Instead, they have two wavy lines running down either side of what's known as their dorsolateral region, meaning between the back and their bellies. So right where the back and the belly meet, right in that area in there, you're going to have some nice wavy lines running down the back. Okay, you can find them statewide again, except for Long Island. They typically start to lay eggs somewhere around about June or September, about 1 to 3 dozen eggs attached to the underside of their rocks. All right, and they'll hatch in about 6 to 13 months, depending on the condition. They do take a while to mature, about 3 to 4 years in this case, which can be a detriment to their overall survival and conservation, because it does take them so long to become adults. So if the habitat becomes disturbed when they're in the larval stage, you won't get those larvae moving to adult anytime soon, unfortunately. This is a good time to talk about another common question that often ends up in my email inbox is how can you tell the difference between a dusky salamander and our other woodland salamanders? Because we have other lungless salamanders, our other plethodonids. This is a great diagram here, kind of showing you the profiles of both of these salamanders. The dusky salamanders that we just talked about on the previous two slides, you can see those down at the bottom. You'll notice that the hind limbs are larger than the front limbs. The head shape on dusky salamanders is also a little bit more shovel shaped. And there's also going to be a white line between the corner of the eye and all the way down to the corner of its jaw. What other woodland salamanders that we're going to be talking about lack a lot of these characteristics. Both limbs, hind limb and front limbs, are going to be more or less the same size, at least the same thickness. And of course, the head is going to be a little bit more roundish in shape, especially the snout, and there's no white line. As far as other plethodonids that we have here, you guys have probably seen these maybe a time or two within your basement, or maybe when you're out exploring streams. You have the northern two-line salamander, Eurycea bistinata, about 4 inches long total length. Nice dull green yellow to bright orangish yellow dorsal coloration, 2 black lines running from the back of the eye all the way down the tip of the tail. There's also about 15 to 16 costal grooves, meaning the grooves along the side or along the belly of this individual, which is a little different, right, than some of the other species we've been talking about. The habitat, again, loves small streams. They can be in some streams with fish in them. They typically love to be underneath those rocks, so you have to be able to explore these regions. It's not uncommon either to find them in moist wood piles and rock piles and such on properties as well. All right, April, they'll lay about 35 to 60 eggs. The larger the female, the more the eggs, and they'll hatch in about 30 days. You can find these everywhere except Long Island. Long-tailed salamander, very similar in appearance here. However, they're much longer, much more mottled with black spots, plenty of orange coloration, and they have, as the name implies, a very long tail that's just about as long, if not slightly longer, than the snout to vent length, basically from the snout to just behind the hind legs of the individual. They have a nice what's called herringbone pattern on their tail. What the herringbone is ultimately these stripes that you see running down the length of the tail. They love to live alongside deciduous forests near the streams, seeps, and of course these are cave lovers as well. They will typically be residing either just a few feet within the cave up towards of about 20, 30 feet or so, depends on the cave. And of course they'll be up on the hillsides away, kind of directly out of the water, underneath rocks and logs and leaf litter and so on, alongside the streams. Lay about 100 eggs or so. They hatch in about 6 months. They'll mature in about 2 years. You can see the counties that they range in across New York State, for everything from Cattaraugus to Allegheny, Steuben, Chemung, Broome. We do have them in Shenango County as well, Delaware, Sullivan, and Orange counties. Northern red salamander, Pseudotriton ruber. It's a very robust salamander, nice black spots adorning the back and the sides, kind of a nice salmonish color that you see here. Loves underneath rocks, mosses, leaves, also springs and small streams as well. This is actually a big time predator of other smaller salamanders. It's pretty well known that this species will take other smaller salamanders if it can wrestle it down its mouth. The larvae here will transform in about 2 years after being laid in autumn or so underneath embedded rocks and debris near or in streams and springs. So they really love to get underneath rocks in a nice protected area. Hudson River Valley from Albany south to Staten Island, and also the western counties bordering PA is where we can find these guys. Spring salamander, very similar to Pseudotriton ruber, our northern red salamander that we just talked about. However, with these guys, they love to be more permanently aquatic. All right, they still lack lungs. They're still part of the Plethodonidae lineage. love nice, cool springs, well-oxygenated springs, as well as fens, and we have been able to find them in caves, particularly eating away at benthic macroinvertebrates. Nice keeled tail on many adults. These guys are about the length of a hot dog and about as girthy as a hot dog as well. The larvae can get rather large, about 4 to 5 inches before they'll transform, but they always have the nice gills on the side of their head as well. You find them statewide, but they are absent from Hudson River and Long Island, as well as some counties bordering the Great Lakes in Canada. Four-toed salamander, often confused with the red-backed salamander, but there's a couple good telltale signs that you're dealing with a four-toed salamander. Number one is the 4 toes on the back limbs. On the back limbs of most other salamanders, you have 5 toes. The four-toed salamander has 4, hence the name. Also, the belly, as you can see here on the four-toed salamander, is going to have a nice salt and pepper belly. Mainly white, and maybe a little bit of light gray depending on the individual, as well as some nice black spots going down through it. These guys typically love fens and bogs. They love to reside underneath, especially females love to reside underneath moss in swamps, bogs, and fens throughout the state. Their distribution within New York State is rather patchy, mainly because we have lost a lot of our wetlands, swamps, fens, and bogs over the past century or so. So they are healthy, but they occur in a very patchy distribution. Northern slimy salamander, Plethodon glutinosis, as the name implies, these guys do exude quite a bit of slime if they are caught or handled a little bit. So you have to be careful here. It's not recommended that you handle them, mainly because that slime that it exudes can stick to your fingers and acts literally like a glue. All right, it can clump up the dirt right around your fingers, and we're strong enough to be able to break this glue. However, another predator like a snake or another salamander is not. One of the rather larger Plethodons, we're looking at somewhere around about 5 to 7 inches total length. Nice jet black back coloration to them, along with some nice white flecking on the surface. This flecking can also be slightly brassy as well, kind of a nice metallic gold if you get up close to it. They love to be up in rocky parts of forests. Right, they love to be up in rocky parts of the forest, typically away from fens, bogs, etc. Okay, and also streams and seeps. They typically will breed in sometime in autumn, and they will retain the eggs and then lay those somewhere around about May or June. Okay. Middle of New York counties is typically where they like to be, all the way down to the Pennsylvania border. They are absent Adirondacks and, of course, Long Island. World salamander, you can only find these in the 5 counties that you see down at the bottom of your screen. Very similar looking to Plethodon glutinosis. Our slimy salamander lives basically in the same type of habitat. The coloration is a little bit more on the purplish side, a little bit more in the deep purple to almost a slate gray, and less white spots. The main difference here and how we discovered that this is a different species is through genetics. So sometimes even by looking at them, if you are in counties that overlap with slimy salamanders, you may not be able to tell the difference because we have to look at its DNA for that. Northern redback salamander, very popular. You can find these guys statewide, and it's probably the first lungless salamander that everybody runs into out in the forest, especially within New York. Love upland forests underneath rocks, logs, leaf piles, you name it. Small and slender, typically have a nice bluish brassy flecking all the way down its sides and across its belly, with a nice kind of salmon to reddish orange stripe running from the head all the way down to the tip of its tail. And of course, we round out with the newts. These guys do have lungs. However, they're not like our other permanently aquatic salamanders like the hellbender or the common mud puppy, nor are they like our unbistomatid salamanders, our cup-mouthed or mole salamanders like our spotted salamander or our Jeffersons. And they're definitely not like our Plethodonid salamanders are lungless salamanders like spring salamanders and redback salamanders and dusky salamanders that we talked about. Instead, these guys are newts. They're a little different. They have a different life stage to them, what's called the eft stage. For their life cycle, they start off as eggs. They'll metamorphose into larvae, basically salamander tadpoles, and then they will reside as a teenager, as I tell my students, in the eft stage for anywhere between 1 to 7 years outside of their aquatic home, migrating somewhere out in the middle, somewhere out in the forest, before they go back to their natal pools, typically their natal pools, and then they metamorphose into full adults as their last stage. The orange individual that you see here on your screen is the red eft stage of the eastern red-spotted newt, often called orange lizards. I often hear the term orange lizard being passed around by many of my students, and also by the general public. They are not lizards at all. They're actually amphibians. They just happen to have a much rougher skin to them. All right, and this, of course, helps them resist drying out, at least when they're in the eft stage. Adults and larvae are fully aquatic. They stay in typically swamps, ponds, you name it. They're really not picky. And then the efts are one of those terrestrial, meaning they will live on land up in the temperate forests. As far as the adults, they actually are known to lay eggs almost year round. They will attach them individually to sticks and leaves, and have also been known to fold over the leaf around an egg and glue them together. So the egg masses, or actually the eggs themselves, are very difficult to find. They hatch in about 3 weeks, and then of course they'll transform. Typically late summer, maybe early fall. The Fs at that stage can literally be about from the tip of your thumb all the way to your first knuckle in total length, snout to tip of the tail. They're incredibly small. The Fs, again, will stay Fs until about 2 to 7 years. It depends on how good the food is and how good the habitat is, until they will reach their full size and then go back to the ponds and become full adults. You can find them statewide. So that rounds out the salamanders. We'll now, of course, talk about the variety of frogs and toads that we have in New York State. Frogs are also known as Inurans, or order Inura, which means the animals without tails. Still have nice, smooth, moist skin. The toads, of course, will have warty skin, small bumps on the surface, and they also have a little bit more keratin in their skin, which helps them resist dehydration. About 5,400 species globally. They're in trouble, though. They are declining due to a variety of things: global climate change, fungal infections, etc. But we have about 14 species in New York. They all have very enlarged muscular hind limbs. Not all of them are going to be webbed. All right, most of our true frogs have heavily webbed skin, which means you'll have skin between their toes. Our toads will have webbed feet. However, the webs will start at about halfway between the fingers on most toads. And then, of course, we have our tree frogs and also our cricket frogs, which will have a varying degree of webbing to almost none at all. Okay? Most are terrestrial, semi-aquatic, some are arboreal. Arboreal means that they climb for a living. They love to be up in trees. And they can, of course, be all found in damp habitats, even the toads. Toads aren't the best swimmers. They typically won't be around ponds or anything like that. They'll be in moist woodlands, but they still need to remain moist. So we'll start off possibly with one of everybody's favorites is the Eastern American toad. Eastern American toad can range about 4 inches. Females are bigger than males. Their coloration varies between almost a nice golden brown all the way through to a nice deep brown. I've seen them almost black on occasion, but that's a rarity. They have 1 to 2 warts per black spot on their back. That's important when identifying them later on with the Fowler's toad, which we'll get to in the next slide. Nice dark pigment. They love to be near water and moist areas. They will move to ponds typically in the late spring, early summer, and begin calling. It's a nice long trill that they can hold for about 30 seconds or so. Ponds and vernal pools, of course, and farm ponds. I've even seen these guys begin to lay eggs in roadside ditches. So in many cases, sometimes they don't really care where they put, where they lay their eggs. They lay them in strings, which kind of look like spaghetti in your hand, which you can see there on the slide. And then, of course, these will hatch out into nice dark black tadpoles as well. They will turn into toadlets at about 2 months and then hop off into the forest to do their toad thing and hunker down for the winter, and then, of course, come back next spring. You can find them statewide except for Long Island. Fowler's toad, virtually the same thing as the Eastern American toad, resembles everything from the coloration to the habitat very, very closely. However, they do have a little bit of difference. They will have up to 3 or more warts per black spot on their back. Calling again begins about mid-April to June, very similar to that of the Eastern American toad. Tadpoles hatch within a few days and go about doing their toad thing, just like the Eastern American toad did very similarly. In this case, we can find them in the southeastern parts of the state, Hudson River Valley, Long Island, Saratoga, and Warren counties. Eastern Spadefoot. This is a unique toad in that it'll have nice large eyes that sit right on top of its head. Very small parotid gland, which is the poison gland. In our 2 previous toads, the Eastern American toad and the Fowler's toad, the parotid gland is very large and elongated, almost oval shaped, resting right behind the eye. Here with Spadefoot toads, the parotid gland is around about the size of a pencil eraser, just above the ear, just above the tympanum or the eardrum. Has very robust hind legs with a spade. It has a ridge of keratin on its heel, you could call it, that actually allows it to dig itself into the nice soft ground where it resides. It's mostly underground for most of the year, but it does come out during heavy rain to consume worms and other invertebrates out on the ground, out on the surface of the ground. You can find these guys in Long Island, Albany, Saratoga, and Dutchess counties only within New York State. Northern spring salamander, my apologies. Northern spring peeper, Siddaker's Crucifer. Probably one of the iconic frogs of the early spring. Everybody practically knows this call from a nice beep, 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 beep that we start to hear very early on from about February, about March, again, depending on when those perfect conditions for early spring migration for amphibians are. Again, 40 to 45 degrees, rain, and the ground thawed out. Typically, you're good to go to start getting amphibians moving, including spring peepers. Ponds, lakes, roadside ditches, vernal pools, you name it, any watery environment, and they're going to like it. And that's typically where you will find them. They have a very nice X-shaped mark on their back, typically very small. They do have enlarged toe tips. We have to stop short of calling them toe pads because they're not true toe pads that the spring peeper has, not compared to something like the gray tree frog that we'll talk about here in a minute. They start calling again from about February, and this can last through about June, depending on the weather conditions. The tadpoles here will hatch out in about 3 months after being laid in early spring. Again, you can find them statewide. Eastern gray tree frog, very, very similar looking to our spring peeper. However, they're much larger, much more robust body. They will have some yellow on the inner portions of their hind legs. They can be about 2 inches long. Females can get slightly over 2 inches long to about 3 inches long, I've seen in some individuals. They will also love temporary and permanent pools, wet areas, also nearly newly disturbed areas. Things like if you're digging a swimming pool or if you have a swimming pool, sometimes they love those areas as well. You can find them statewide. They are absent from the Catskills and the Adirondacks. They will begin calling and laying eggs somewhere around about May in lower elevations to July, again, depending on your elevation. The eggs hatch in about a week. They'll transform in about 2 months. Northern cricket frog, smallest frog in New York State. They could fit right on your thumb. They're very, very tiny. They have small dorsal warts. Some of them will have a nice stripe that's typically on the green side. It can range anything from a nice bright green, like what you see here, to almost a deep forest green. All right, an evergreen green that you see ranging on the back. Wet ponds and wetlands is where they love to be. All right. They will always choose a permanent, opy, sunny, shallow pool with very dense vegetation to lay their eggs, which will start after they emerge in about March to early April. They'll forage and then they will begin to lay their eggs after about 6 to 8 weeks. So they like to bulk up a little bit before they lay their eggs. Ulster, Duchess, and Orange County is where their range is restricted to within New York State. Western chorus frog, so indicated by his nice 3 stripes running from the snout or just behind the eyes all the way down to between its hind legs. Dark facial mask as well, nice kind of dark eyes on either side. The belly is typically white, either a bright white to kind of a nice cream color, if you will. The toe discs, again, they're not full toe discs, or like what we would see with tree frogs, but they are kind of half moon shaped, if you will. So they aren't as developed as other tree frogs or as other cricket frogs. They do have webbing way down at the base in between the toes. Wet fields, wet grasslands, wet meadows, forest edges, as long as they're wet, are typically areas where these guys love to be. Males have a more tanned coloration. Females have more of a nice white throat patch to them. So there's a little bit of difference between the genders here. Right? Between 500 to 1,500 eggs laid in many small masses throughout the habitat here. So a bit different strategy. Rather than putting all the eggs in one spot, they like to spread out the clutches a little bit. Hatch in about 5 to 10 days, which is pretty quick, and then to transform in about 2 to 3 months. The counties here, again, along the eastern shore of Lake Ontario and the St. Lawrence River. Probably one of the classic frogs of New York, bullfrog. Bullfrogs can get very large and they have a very ravenous appetite. Upwards of 6 to 8 inches long from the snout to between the legs, what's known as the urostyle. The belly will be a nice yellow. This frog is often confused with the green frog of New York as well. However, there's one key difference that you look for, and it's on the back. Bullfrogs do not have a fold of skin running from the back of the head down to between the legs. They do not have a fold of skin. It's what's known as the dorsolateral fold. Bullfrogs do not have that. If you see a frog that has a nice smooth back to it with no lines, it's a bullfrog, no matter how big it is. Males will also have a much larger eardrum, a tympanum, than females will as well. Right? You can find these guys in practically every aquatic habitat. Everything from lakes and streams, but they particularly love ponds and lakes. You can find them particularly in any aquatic habitat. The call here sounds like a nice, deep, long cello. So very nice, deep, long sound these here, almost like a bass sound to it. They emerge in February, but they bulk up a little bit and don't start calling until April or May or June in some of the higher elevations after they eat a little bit more. Their eggs are laid in what's known as a surface film, meaning it's not a string and it's not a clump. It's actually laid in a nice thin film on the very surface of the water. Green frogs do this too, but there's a size difference. For the bullfrogs, their egg masses are larger than 12 inches. For green frogs, it's smaller than 12 inches, but it's right there on the surface. You can find bullfrogs statewide. As far as what that surface film looks like, you can see that here. Again, it's very, very thin. It's a very thin film right at the surface, maybe with a little bit of frothiness to it too, excuse me. Green frog, often confused with bullfrog, as I mentioned before, but you can see that nice dorsolateral fold extending from the eyes all the way down to behind the legs here, from the head all the way down to behind the legs. There is also a little bit of striping that occurs on the hind legs of green frogs. They can range anywhere from a nice solid green color to mottling to a little bit of brown. And I've even seen some with a little bit almost as a light black coloration of mottling on their back as well. But it was a green frog. Again, nearly every aquatic habitat. These guys have several calls to them. They have what's known as the out of tune banjo string that you often hear, and that is the call that males give off to the females during breeding season. But there's also an alarm call that they do as well that many of you have probably heard if you've ever walked by some aquatic environment near ponds, pools, lakes, and even streams where you'd be walking along, all of a sudden you hear a meh, plop, 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 plop. And that meh that you hear is actually the alarm call of the green frog. And what that's there to do is alarm the other frogs in the neighborhood that there is a predator. If it's you walking across, it's you that it's alerting everybody to, but it's also there to try and get the predator to startle itself, startle the predator and get a chance to wonder what that noise was. Meanwhile, the plop, plop, plop that you hear is the frog actually jumping and swimming away as they make their escape from that split second of the predator being startled and wondering what that noise was. Tadpoles can remain tadpoles for up to 1 to 2 years. It's similar to that with bullfrogs as well, but bullfrog tadpoles can actually last between 3 to 5 years in some instances. Again, it depends on the water conditions. The better the water conditions, typically the faster the growth. You can find green frogs statewide. One of the common questions that I get to is how do you tell the difference between a green frog and a bullfrog tadpole? Because both of them are big. Really quick, the bottom one is a green frog tadpole. Green frog tadpoles have a heavier green mottled coloration to them, especially on their tail, and they're more streamlined. Bullfrog tadpoles will be very large, almost about 1.5 inches to 2 inches or so on their body. Their tail will be much thicker or broader, and they'll often have nice muscular lumps going from the base of the tail forward to the head as well. They're also a little bit more solid in their coloration, meaning ranging from kind of a creamy green to kind of a deeper green, but typically less mottling. Wood frog, Lithobates sylvaticus. This is also another icon of the amphibian icon of the spring. They're about 3 inches total length. Females get bigger. Nice salmon coloration that you see here on most individuals. Nice dorsal lateral fold going from behind the eye all the way down to between the legs. Striping on the hind legs, as well as a nice dark mask that you see here around the eyes. Their call sounds like a duck quacking, or so I'm told. It's more of a type of call that you'll hear again early spring. Once you have those 3 conditions that are met right around about February, March, early April, you'll start to hear these, and they of course lay their eggs in some nice globular egg masses, but they do tend to run through your fingers kind of like spaghetti if you do hold them in your hand. Statewide is where you can find them. Other frogs that we have, the pickerel frog, Lithobates palustris. With this frog, this is a spotted frog, often confused with the leopard frog. However, the colorations and the pattern running down the back is a little different here between the two. The 2 rows of dark blotches running from the head all the way down the back are squarish or rectangular-ish, all right, on the back of these frogs. The other telltale difference that you're dealing with a pickerel frog is looking at the hind legs. If you see yellow on the hind legs, it's a pickerel frog. Leopard frogs don't have this, all right? Leopard frogs do not have yellow on their legs, okay? Permanent pools, ponds, marshes, slow-moving streams is absolutely where pickerel frogs love to be. I find them every once in a while in the fields around my house as well. So they typically love even wet meadows as well, depending on where you are. They'll begin calling somewhere around about March or April. It's a very slow, low-pitched snore that they'll put off, and you can even call from underwater. So if you're out at night at your local pond, or maybe the pond on your property, and you hear this nice low-pitched snore and you're out there trying to find the frog, chances are it's probably a male calling from underneath the water. They'll actually position themselves on a stick or a piece of or blade of grass that's underneath the water, they'll position themselves so that way they're face down, their hind legs will be sticking up behind them, and they will be calling underneath the water. However, it's so loud it actually does seem like it's calling from on top of the water. So keep that in mind the next time you're looking for a calling pickerel frog. You can find these guys statewide. Northern leopard frog, as I mentioned before, look alike to the pickerel frog. These guys get a little bit bigger, however, on the order of about 3 inches or so, 3.5 inches, snout to urostyle length. Their belly on the underside is pure white, no yellow on them at all. The blotches on their back are rounder. So they're circle to oval rather than squarish or rectangular. Squarish or rectangular, again, was for pickerel frog. Round or oval is for leopard frog. So another indication. They emerge in March. Call begins about mid to end of March or so. Again, depends on where you are in the state. The call here is a snort or a grunt. They hear it's very short. All right, it's a very, very short type of call. Tadpoles will hatch in about a week, and they'll transform in about 3 months. They have all counties except Long Island is where you can find them. We also have the southern leopard frog, very similar to the northern, and very similar to the northern leopard frog that we had mentioned. It has an unbroken dorsolateral fold, which can be highlighted about a yellow to a bronzy color, all right, that we see running from the eye down to the urostyle, down to between the legs. Very heavily rounded spots, and they are round as well. They are round, and it has bunches of them up and down the back. So that's a little bit different from the northern leopard frog that we mentioned. Again, moist meadows, permanent and semi-permanent wetlands is where we can find them. They're restricted, however, in New York State. Long Island and Rockland, Putnam, Westchester, and Dutchess counties is really where they hail from. You're not going to see them come out of those counties really anytime soon. And of course, we have the mink frog. Mink frog looks very, very similar to that of a bullfrog or a green frog. Their coloration and modeling can be a little bit heavier than those two, however. They have a nice olive gray back to them and very dark modeling. The markings on the back of the legs can run parallel along the long axis, so down the leg rather than across the thigh like we've seen with other frogs. So it runs down the leg rather than across the thigh. Webbing on the feet in this case can actually extend past the last joint of the 4th and 5th toe. It actually ends, the webbing on things like bullfrogs and green frogs actually ends shorter than that. So that's another kind of indication here. The belly can be a grayish white in this case, rather than a cream color or yellow color that we saw in some of its lookalikes earlier. It gets its name mink frog because when disturbed, it actually produces a very musky and foul odor to it that actually smells a little bit like mink oil, hence the name to it. It actually has nothing to do with how it behaves as a mink or anything like that. It actually is about the smell. Cold northern lakes and streams is where this frog loves, particularly in the northeastern counties, all right, around the Adirondack Mountains, and also the Tug Hill Plateau and St. Lawrence and Champlain Lowlands is where where this frog really hails from there. Males gather in shallow pools throughout summer. June, July, August is really their time to begin to lay eggs. Choruses are temporary. They kind of pop up here and there. They lay nice globular egg masses. Tadpoles will graze on algae. They'll overwinter for a year until they metamorphose the following year, transforming somewhere around about July or August that following year. I think that just about brings us to the end of this exploration into New York's amphibians, both for salamanders and frogs. I get plenty of questions year-round, really, and I love questions from the general public, from students, everybody else. So if you ever have a question or you think of a question later on after this presentation and you want to give me a buzz, my email address is down there at Morrisville, so feel free to email me if you have a question or identification question. I get plenty of those every year and be happy to help you out.